All right. All right, everybody. Thank you for watching. This is Neeshee Pandit. Am I pronouncing that right?
Got it.
All right. So Neeshee is a Vedic astrologer and an Ayurvedic health practitioner. And we're going to talk about Vedic astrology and its relationship to Ayurveda. So with that being said, then, I'll ask the first question I have here, which is, how are Vedic astrology and Ayurveda similar?
Okay. I'm going to give a kind of a broad picture right off the bat then, since you're asking a very broad question. Basically, my feeling is that Ayurveda is something that grew out of astrology. If we look at traditional medicine altogether, we can see that it's actually something that grows out of an astrological understanding of life. So I want to just at the outset, make it clear that my sense of all of this is that astrology precedes medicine.
Interesting. So are
medicine,
you
saying... And that's not to say that they don't intersect and that they don't interrelate and influence each other and develop simultaneously, cross-culturally and so forth. Of course, that's the case, with just about everything, especially with those two systems.
So are you saying that like you're saying like Ayurveda comes out of astrology? Do you mean like that there was first a mindset and an awareness of astrology by people, or are you talking about just in a general sense of manifestation?
I mean, subjectively.
Okay.
I feel like, astrology is actually something that has been with human beings since more or less the beginning of time. It's been an observation that has become more and more sophisticated as culture and evolution has allowed for that to become sophisticated. Now we have science, for example. We actually can measure things in different ways. We have computers, we can put in complex calculations and see things we couldn't, we wouldn't even imagine to calculate before. So obviously evolution plays its role. But what I'm saying is that astrology and the understanding of the human relationship to the cosmos, via celestial bodies and the movement of the stars and all that's entailed in that is a root understanding, amongst human beings in specific cultures. And medicine is something that develops from that understanding, because we see the same principle at the root of medicine, in China, whether it's Chinese medicine, Tibetan medicine, or Ayurveda, especially in the East, even in Greek medicine, you're going to see that principle of the macrocosm is in the microcosm, vice versa. That fact is basically what medicine is revolving around, right? And then we talk about 5 elements. There's all these things that articulate it, But that's the basic thing. And so that's why I think that astrology is really the foundation for so many endeavors. There's philosophy, there's so many things, but especially with medicine, we see that astrology is providing kind of a root framework, Right. So you were asking me about the relationship between Vedic astrology and Ayurveda, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I think that as time has gone on, Ayurveda has become obviously something in and of itself, and I think Ayurveda could benefit from going back to its astrological roots more, I think that what we have now is what I would call contemporary Ayurveda, and in a lot of ways, it's not the same as very traditional Ayurveda or Ayurveda that's very scriptural.
Right. I think that there's a lot of what I call a spa Ayurveda out there.
Yeah, it's become pop. Which is nothing wrong with that either, because there's a lot of great wisdom that's now becoming, extended, in a more global scale. Great.
Well, you could look at that in America with the yoga community also.
Yeah. I mean, it's great. People are doing, yoga asanas now instead of just running on treadmills. At the same time, yoga is not just a form of exercise. It's actually something profound. So it's like, we get those fallacies everywhere we look. There's always the pro and the con. Same thing with Ayurveda now that it's becoming so popular. That's why I wanted to say this about it really being founded in astrology. And the reason we need to really get that is because if we start to explore the relationship between Ayurveda and astrology, we're going to see discrepancies. I see discrepancies. What Brihad Parashara Shastra says what Charaka Samhita says, there are some differences, you know? It's
Right.
like there are some real differences. If you look at David Frawley and the way he's articulated Ayurveda and astrology, you look at, you know, Brihad Parashara, there's some discrepancies there,
Yeah.
you know, and those are not easily resolved discrepancies. And those are basically the discrepancies of what was one tradition now being set into two.
Right.
And so we can resolve them actually just by, you know, a real consideration of what do these things really mean. You know, it can become obvious, but there are these surface discrepancies.
What I see, I want to kind of touch on what you said with, I never really thought about it in that way of looking at it as astrology coming first, but it does make sense because the second that we're born, you know, I'm not the second we're born, but as we look up, we're naturally drawn to look towards the sky. We're drawn to look at the stars on a clear day. I mean, maybe not in our modern cities, but what I look at is, so that's just something that's natural. That's always happened. Like you said, like that really makes a lot of sense. And there's a lot more awareness of that. Now, when I think of Ayurveda, one of the things I think about, like it's always talked about as being 5,000 years old. And 5,000 years ago is basically the start of our kind of modern civilization. So I always look at Ayurveda as kind of like the study of the diseases of civilization.
Right.
Because that to me is what it seems to be about. Because I would think that if one were living in nature, with nature, that the chance for disease is kind of a moot point.
Definitely the consideration of medicine has become increasingly relevant over the course of evolution, because as humans have evolved, so has disease. So have conditions, you know, that cause disease. I mean, there's always been disease, you know, and if we look to the past, even been some horrible diseases and plagues and epidemics and things that, you know, people couldn't fight that they die of, that today, you know, you just take an antibiotic, you know. So definitely there's, like, again, two streams there, you know. But I like what you're saying, because I feel like you're articulating something that I'm trying to say also, which is that I think in saying that astrology precedes medicine, I'm also pointing to like a really ancient understanding of the cosmos that's inherent, you know, in culture and amongst human beings, which is amazing. That is like a philosophical framework from which to then go into something like Ayurveda that tells you, okay, so what do you do about it? You know, how do we live our life now that we know that this is how life works? You know, what is the right way to live a life? You know?
So would you say in a certain essence then that Ayurveda is almost like a form of remedy?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's one way of looking at it, which is that Ayurveda is like a subset, you know, of astrology. It's like, now that you know all this is how everything works, you know, and we know that when we live in harmony with that which we are inherently a part of, we are healthy and happy, you know, and energy flows the way it should flow. Ayurveda has now kind of put that into an entire system, highly sophisticated system. Now we have the articulation of doshas, of the 5 elements. You know, then we have anatomy and physiology, which now anatomy and physiology is, you know, much more developed than it was 5,000 years ago also. And in many ways, exactly the same as what they said 5,000 years ago. So it becomes really microscopic and really about, what do you do? What are the remedies, you know?
Right.
Which is what medicine is. Medicine is a remedial measure. You know, it is the science of remedial measures.
Right. Right. So now my next question.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to Ayurveda and astrology, how can they be used to complement each other? Between the processes, let's just look at this real quick. Let's just identify the process of like Ayurvedic health consultation and astrology reading. So like the interaction or just the understanding that one has of each of the two sciences, so to speak.
Okay, that's a great question. Pathology is coming from several directions. Okay. Ayurveda is going to identify some of those directions, okay, some of those originating points. Mm-hmm. Astrology is going to identify a whole other origination of pathology, a whole other direction from which it's flowing into the human physiology, right?
Right.
It's like there's downward causation, there's upward causation, you know, there's the 5 koshas. It's like, on the one hand, just because we're karmically existing, disease is inherent, you know, that's like the spiritual, you know, root of disease, you know, that's always going to ripple through the koshas into the physical body, always, you know, no matter how well you live, at some point you're going to die too. So that's sort of the,
would you say then that there is, because it's something I've been really thinking about lately, is that it's like, there's who we are, which has really, in a spiritual context, doesn't really have to do with this body,
right?
But it does. And so I think about like the difference between genetics and like genetic inheritance and spiritual, like karmic inheritance.
Yeah, exactly. You know, so the human totality is actually so vast. You know, what we are when we're looking at another human being, you know, in a health consultation, we're looking at a vast process that extends through a temporal sequence that's not just in the present. It actually includes all of the past, you know, and we have to also think about where is it going, you know, where do we want it to go? That's going to be lawful for this person, you know? So it's like all of time is really being considered when we're talking about health. Right. That's why astrology is so important, because astrology is about time. And especially, you know, astrology is going to help us fill in the blank of karmic pathology, you know, which I have to say, as time goes on for me, I see is a bigger and bigger part of what people are experiencing. You know, it's like, it's Ketu, you know, the genetic pattern, the ancestral pattern, the past life pattern, the karmic pattern in all of its dimensions is Ketu. And that is what we have that as part of us, you know, manifested in the present. Ketu's there, you know, all the past is now in the present. And it's not like you can just wipe that clean, you know, by doing panchakarma, you know, you can't. The wiping of karma is a spiritual process. So that's why, you know, I started out by saying that there's spiritual disease, you know, because we're born in a karmic world, you know, we're born with a sense of separation from everything around us, you know, which is not even a true reflection of how things are.
Which,
you know? So
kind of belies a certain aspect of disease into manifestation.
Exactly. Right? That disease is always rippling through, you know? And so then you have that always happening, that kind of inherent pathology that can only be resolved by a spiritual process, you know? That has nothing to do with medicine then. That's a completely different physics, okay?
Right.
Then you have like the disease of like the mind, you know, like the manomaya kosha, you know, the vijnanamaya kosha, the higher mind, psychic disease, you know, the disease of being an Atman, you know, being a separate soul, you know, the feeling of being form, you know, separated from other forms is a disease too. And that's going to ripple into the mind. And once you get into the mind, you have Rahu and Ketu as the nodes of the moon, you know, and it's like the subconscious, the unconscious, the psychology, the strategies, you know, what we see in the Avashtas, all of that.
Yeah. I so much. I think so much about the moon, Rahu and Ketu, the two, you know, the Earth's plane of orbit, and that's what the energy that represents Rahu and Ketu and how powerful that is to us.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly, you know, the point is that we have to identify, and this is part of what I'm really interested in articulating, is we have to identify the scope of things. We have to identify the scope of medicine. You know, what can medicine actually treat? To what level can we treat? You know, I say we can treat basically up to manomaya kosha, you know, the mind, then before that, the energy, the etheric body, and then you can treat, you know, the physical body and all the pathologies that originate at those levels, okay? Beyond that, though, you're entering into a whole level and dimension that is really more of a spiritual process, you know?
Right.
I think astrology actually can go one kosha further than medicine, you know? But that depends on the astrologer, you know, and their philosophical orientation and their ability to reach that depth with the person and to perceive it and to treat it, you know? So
let me ask you a question then. In your astrology practice, are you more about like describing people's story of life, like this, you are in Saturn, Venus, and you are going to get a car that is yellow on this day? Or are you more of like, these are the karmic patterns that have beset you in your life and how you can work with them and what is kind of like you're up against? Is that kind of more where you're coming from?
Absolutely. I'm absolutely the latter, you know. Not that there's no virtue in the former, but it's just not where I'm working, you know, because I'm interested in astrology for a therapeutic purpose.
Right.
You know?
Right. It's so
That's
funny. I come from the same exact way. And every so often I get the clients that are like, I want this. When is this coming for me or something like that? And I cringe.
Yeah, I know. I get them too. You know, when you're an astrologer, you're always going to get people who just want a straight prediction.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I do one of two things. I either have them fill out one of those electronic reports on my website that deal with the kind of things that I don't feel like I need to be spending my time getting into with people. They can just get those answers through, you know, those reports Ernst made, which are fantastic, actually. You know, sort of like Muhurta and relationship compatibility and those type of things, financial timing. I don't really want to concern myself with that in a consultation, you know. So I'd rather people get those answers in a simple way. You know, the other thing, I'll just refer them out to somebody who's really specializes in prediction. Because people I want to work with are interested in a therapeutic process. You know, more or less, I tend to attract those people, you know.
Right.
That's what I think true function of astrology is, you know.
Right. Because like, I'm always trying to be aware of how I can affect someone's karma, basically. And so like, I don't want to necessarily people to think that, okay, you're just going to sit around and get things to a certain schedule and I'm holding the schedule here and I know how to read your schedule or whatever. It's like, I want people to engage more with the real issues that they're here to face and to see the bigger picture. So
exactly. See, an astrology reading, you know, is really, to me, about understanding. You know, it's about awakening and understanding in somebody through a reflective process. And that is a level of understanding that actually goes beyond the mind. You know, it actually can reach like the soul level in a person, you know, and that's more powerful than anything medicine can do for them. Because when you do that, you can reach a level of pathology that's originating at such a deep level in the person. And that is going to set them up for a better health, you know, in a way that no amount of right diet, no amount of anything can do for them. You know, it's like, it's even a step beyond counseling because you're not actually trying to work out a problem with them. You're just pointing out that, look, there are these patterns, you know, that govern our life. And these are the patterns governing your parent life. And you don't even have to identify with it. You know, it doesn't mean anything really necessarily. It's just, this is just how it happens to be. What are you going to do about that? How are you going to navigate that? And what's the transformative calling of your life in the midst of that, you know? That's like an awakening of consciousness then, you know? In a way, you can say all disease is a form of unconsciousness. And healing is a process of gaining consciousness. When we gain ultimate consciousness, we're fully conscious. Well, you could say that's enlightenment, you know?
Right.
So, but there's various zones of that unconscious, though. It's like some people eat horribly, you know, and they're sick. And it's like, well, look, if you were a little more conscious about your diet and you understood that this is how your constitution is, these are the ways you should eat during these times of the year, you'll feel a lot better, you know? That's great. Bring consciousness there. It's like, man, your emotional life is like wreaking havoc. You know, you're doing drugs all the time. Your energy's all over the place. Like, maybe you should just stop and, you know, consider meditating or something. Well, that's going to help too. So
now with this kind of, I think this kind of ties into, I kind of have a few questions here is like, we talk about health. Like, what is like the Ayurvedic description of health?
The Ayurvedic description of health is actually this, you know, one of my favorite quotes from the Charaka Samhita, which is that health is not simply the absence of disease. Health is the harmonious functioning, you know, of the three doshas, the seven dhatus, and the three waste products, you know, all with a sense, mind, and consciousness that has clarity and balance, you know. It's actually quite a holistic definition.
It's quite a humongous definition too.
Yeah, in other words, a physiology that's functioning the way it should at a physical, emotional, and mental level. So
now let me ask you this. Now, what does a birth chart then say to kind of modify what someone's version of health is? And more so, like the parameters that are given with the natal promise of a chart.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how is that? Is it healthy to be living within those parameters, or is it more about like learning to work with that or move past it? And then how do you use the chart to help someone find health, or how can we use our own charts to find a more healthy being of who this incarnation is?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the chart is going to show some really basic factors, which is, what is the play of the elements in this person's life, at the level of their body, at the level of their mind,
Mm-hmm.
what kind of elements are dominating them? Like, you occasionally I see these charts where it's like a person has like ascendant and something else, Aries, and everything else is in Leo. And it's like, okay, wow, it's like you only have fire element. This is pretty unusual. You
Right.
also know it can be pretty imbalancing. So on the one hand, you can see things like that. Then you can, if you look at the doshas and the planets and how that connects with the Rashis, then you can start to see like what kind of doshas are dominant in them and what's the balance of that. Because we need all three doshas, right? We all have all three doshas because everything is
Right.
5 elements. So, but what is the play of that? It's like, we see somebody who's like really on the Vata side here, and it's like they really don't have much Kapha. Well, we know that that's going to be their struggle, with health. So we're going to recommend things to them that bring in more of that stability, and that earth element and that balance of Kapha and the juice. So I think we can see those kinds of imbalances very quickly, in a chart. We also can see, though, through Rahu and Ketu, what's happening in their mind, and how big of an issue is that, like what kind of signs are Rahu and Ketu in, what house placements are they in, it's like some of those can be very intense.
Right.
So then we know that we got to fix their diet and all that. That's great, but the real issue is coming from Rahu and Ketu, and so if we don't deal with that, it doesn't matter how well they eat, they're always going to feel totally stressed, totally out of whack,
Right. Yeah, because recommendations and implementation are two whole things. And as an Ayurvedic practitioner, you're there with them for 1/1,000,000th of their life or whatever, 1/1,000,000th of their time on earth, and you can give them books and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't care how much stuff you give them, you're not there holding their hand.
No, and that's why the question I ask myself more than any other question when I'm working with somebody is, what does this person need? What do they need? I'm not interested in a formulaic thing like, okay, you're talking to me and I'm do Ayurveda and I do astrology. So I'm looking at your chart. I'm going to tell you like you should eat khichdi and you should, wake up with the sunrise and, don't stay up past 10 and take these herbs. These are really good for you. And make sure you have all 6 tastes in your diet and you're a Vata type. So, you need to make sure that you really have enough, sweet taste and salty taste. And, it's like that doesn't really interest me too much. It's because what people actually need varies dramatically, whereas I might have somebody, I had one case where a person was having a digestive distress, and I asked them, well, what are they eating? And they said, oh, well, it all started when I moved to this place and I was, I have to live in this ashram and they had served this food and it's really spicy, And I said, well, you're like a huge pitta person, so that's like majorly aggravating to you. And he said, well, yeah, it all started when I moved here and ate this food. And I said, well, all you really need to do is just make your own food. It's like, you can't eat that food. That was his solution. It's like, I didn't really have to get into anything beyond that. I think those are more rare, to be honest with you.
And it's kind of funny. So I know like Ryan Kerjak, for example,
mm-hmm.
Before he does anybody's chart, I don't know if you've ever heard about this, he assesses like Jupiter and the 5th house.
Right, to see if they're going to be open to feedback.
Right. Right. I've never gone that far with it or anything. I don't even actually look at that, but I think that that's interesting that he does that. And then he just refers out at that point.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting way of screening, you know?
Right.
I think it depends. If you have a big volume, you have to find ways to screen so that the people who really benefit from what you have to offer are going to get that, you know? I just let fate kind of settle it out for me, you know?
Right. Right.
If I'm giving somebody a reading, I know that that's how it's meant to be for them and for me, you know?
What I find most interesting is it's like the more that I apply myself to study and start looking at charts, the more clients I get.
Yeah.
It is really fascinating to me because I took a couple months off because this is just how my process works. I like to process things, you know, find out really where I'm at, where I want to go with it. And I wasn't generating any clients. And the second I stepped back, just in like with in the mental arena of just like bringing that into my consciousness, thinking about the planets again, start looking at charts again, all of a sudden I'm getting requests for readings.
Yeah, there's an ebb and flow to it that's totally the way it should be, you know? It's like, I definitely go, you know, if I'm not doing readings, then I'm writing, you know? And I'm reading other things and like processing and trying to articulate, you know, some of my ideas about astrology and therapy and healing, you know? And I notice when I reach like a new understanding, it's like then I kind of re-enter and it's like I get all these requests for readings, you know? But when I'm going into that more introspective mode, it's like I don't get any requests for readings.
Right. Right.
You know? It's like I'm off the grid, you know, and in a way it worked because I need that too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
When I re-enter the arena, I'm offering something I didn't have before.
And I honestly don't know how people can be full-time astrologers, like only source of income. And I don't mean that it doesn't pay. I just mean that that's a lot of like where's the time to study? Where's the time to introspect? Where's the time to reflect? If all you're doing is trying to read the patterns of other people, that's difficult life.
It's not easy. It's not easy, you know? Ideally that happens like much later on when you've had enough time to devote to research. But to me, it's a lifetime process, you know?
Right. Right.
You know, I think, you know, and I wrote this on the forum the other day that there's that famous essay by Galen, you know, the Greek physician, who said that the best doctor is also a philosopher. And I said that, you know, I'll take that to another level and say that I think that the best astrologer is also a philosopher. You know? So astrologers need to have time, you know, to contemplate these things.
Right, right. You know, what's funny is I spend a lot of time contemplating how they did it back then. So much for granted with what we're able to do, calculate. You get a new client, all you need is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 numbers, you know, day, month, year, time. Yeah. And then if you want to break it down into latitude, longitude, you need like 7 numbers, or 9 numbers. And then boom.
I think all of that suggests that, you know, the astrology that was done by the ancients was really done at a very high level and was more or less a psychic process.
Right.
Not that it didn't have an empirical element. Clearly it did, you know, because we are talking about planets. We're talking about birth times and birth data. I mean, we're not just flying off the cuff, you know, but there was a strong psychic element to it, I think. And I think the more that element of it can come through in a reading, the better.
Right. And what's really funny, like I've kind of stepped into a new level of, I don't know, of my own basically when it comes to charts. I used to kind of be like, oh man, if I didn't spend, because I used to do this write-up before, I wouldn't give it to the people. It was just for my study, you know, where I would be like going over all these different aspects of the chart. I had this huge template that I would, and like, but it was a great study process. And now I'm to the point where it's like, I go in there, I have an idea of what I see in the chart, but I know that once I'm talking to them that there's what aspects that I'll need to bring out will come to me at that time. It's really interesting.
Exactly. That's totally it, man. That is the way to do it. I'm more and more like don't spend hardly any time in prep. Mm-hmm. I just let it be like that moment's, you know, process. And I open the chart when I'm with the person, because when you're with the person, you're reading the chart, something about it unlocks at a level that it doesn't unlock when you're just looking at their chart. So I don't like to get too many ideas about their chart when I'm not doing their reading with them. It's like, I'll kind of get, like you said, a basic sense of some things that kind of stand out to me. But then I'm really going to let the reading unfold with them.
You know, what's funny is I've gone back and forth with exactly what you just said. Like, I've jumped on both sides of that fence, where there was a point in time where I felt like it was cheating if I knew the person first, or if I'd seen them in person before I looked at their chart. Because I felt like if I could look at their chart like objectively, then I could get a better reading for it. Where if I see them in person, it's like I'm already gonna clue into that. You know, fascinating.
Yeah, it is fascinating. You know, I ultimately believe more in like a psychophysical process around astrology readings. And I remember when I was spending some time with Ernst not too long ago, he was saying that, yeah, you know, the more prep you do, kind of the more confusing it all gets. It's like the best is the reading happens with that person, you know, and they merit a certain amount of reading from you, you know, and it's like, you don't know what that's going to be. I think every reading I give is so different. I always come in with this idea like, oh yeah, these are the type of readings I do. You know, and it's like, then I'm faced with this person who's invariably totally unique, totally different from somebody else, and has a totally different set of stuff, and totally requires something totally different from me, you know, and it's like, wow, I just have to just let go of the whole thing and just respond, you know?
Right. I'll tell you what I'm learning right now is to like use my pitta a little bit more than use my kapha nature, because I tend to want to be too soft and gentle with people, you know, and kind of like tell them the positive side of things. It's what I'm stepping actually into that, just kind of like, this is what I see.
Yeah, exactly.
It can be a little negative. You don't take that to like, and I try and make sure that my, the words that I use aren't like going to create negative self-doubt or whatever.
And I always try to frame it, you know, in the context of a transformative understanding and a transformative process for them, so that it's not like I'm just pointing out their strengths and weaknesses and it's like, oh great, now you know something more about yourself, you know, go figure out your life. It's like, it's more like, well, this is the way it is, and this is what that really means for you. It's like, this is the import of that, you know, the potential of that.
Now, let me ask you another question now.
Sure.
So we already talked about like how Ayurveda and astrology can kind of like complement each other. Now, if you're going into an Ayurvedic consultation, do you have a birth chart that you look at every time? Is that a requirement? And so basically what I'm asking is, do you always apply astrology to your Ayurvedic health consultations, and vice versa? Are you always coming from like a Ayurvedic perspective to your astrology readings?
Okay, to the first question, yes, I always include astrology with my Ayurvedic consults. If people approach me just for an Ayurvedic thing, I'm definitely going to ask them for their birth data. I'm not even going to see people, you know, if I don't have their birth data, because to me that is the indispensable knowledge. You know, right. I used to do astrology, and then, you know, I see people for Ayurveda, and that's a whole other thing. I just do my Ayurveda thing. But more and more I realize, like, no, you know, it's just, these have to just totally merge, you know? So for me, it's one thing. People often ask me now, it's like, are you still doing Ayurveda? And I say, yeah, I am, but I'm doing it all through astrology.
Right.
You know? So, yeah, I'm doing astrology, but that's all encompassing for me now. That's the widest lens I have available.
Now, I understand that you have like a background in Tibetan medicine as well. Now, with that being said, and I know that you said you've worked with Ernst, who comes from a homeopathic background. So is Ayurveda the only tool that you're using from a health perspective when you're talking with people, or are you drawing from whatever kind of resonates with the person or whatever you found to get results with?
I would say that I'm drawing upon a stream.
Okay.
You know, in which there's a lot of different currents, you know, and all those currents are everything that I've dipped into, you know, Ayurveda, Tibetan medicine, homeopathy, you know, and even everything I study about about psychoanalysis and psychotherapy and Freud and Jung and, you know, all of that, you know,
Yeah.
from the Western side of the fence. I say I'm drawing upon all of that in terms of formulating a therapeutic approach. What's going to come out for somebody is, again, that question I ask myself is, what does this person need? You know, and lately I've been using a lot more homeopathy. For one, because I want to try it and I want to see how it works, you know. So there's just the kind of research element of it, you know. And I'm also trying to help gather data for Ernst and things like that. So there's that part of it. But I'm also interested to treat that level, because I think homeopathy is treating a level that Ayurveda can't treat, you know, a level that Tibetan medicine can't treat, you know. We're treating the mind, you know, the manomaya kosha. That's really significant, and I don't see another therapy that reaches that level so well. Psychotherapy does, you know, for sure, if it's really done at that level, you know. But homeopathy really works through the manomaya kosha and the pranamaya kosha, you know, so it really rebalances the energy that's getting imbalanced from the mind. So I use that, you know. But for other people, they might approach me and say, hey, you know, I came to you because I love Ayurveda. Well, for them, I'm going to use an Ayurvedic approach because they've made it clear to me that's what really resonates with them, you know? So great, I'll totally work within that framework for them. But more and more, I really prefer to have the freedom, you know, to use whatever seems like the right thing.
So now what I kind of want to look at is, let's talk a little bit more about specifically planets, houses, and signs. And so let's go ahead and start with the planets and the nature of the planets. And so obviously, like there's an do you look at it from the 5 elemental perspective, or more so like the doshic consideration granted to each planet?
You know, I've always felt like the doshas are just a rearticulation of the 5 elements, you know, in a very handy way. Mm-hmm. So I think the 5 elements is really a more root consideration. So I typically am going to look, for whatever reason, when I'm looking at signs, I typically look at elements. You know, I don't think about signs and doshas too much, even though that correlation exists. I think about planets and doshas more.
Right. Absolutely. Because what's interesting is I have this little list. I just went over, before I talked to you, with Brihat Parashara Horashastra and what he says about the signs. And I only came up with 6 signs where I could say, I don't read the Sanskrit yet. I'm actually, my goal is to learn to read Sanskrit. But I'm just reading the translation, and only in Aries, Gemini, Cancer, Virgo, Sag, and Aquarius does he say something that sounds like, it doesn't exactly say, it says like airy temperament, or, you know, something that sounds like a description of one of the doshas. Whereas I know Ernst and other people have taken it from, you know, the wide body of older texts. I'm just using one text that I just happen to have at my table right now. And I thought that's interesting, because every single one, though, is related to an element, well, of the 4 of the 5 elements anyhow. Yeah,
exactly. So here is where I think it gets really difficult, you know, because the language is not precise. You know, are we talking dosha or are we talking guna? You know, is it a doshic, you know, are we talking about dosha in terms of the mind? Or are we talking dosha in terms of the physiology? You know, it's like, because often you'll see in astrological texts, you talk about dosha as a temperament indicator. Right. Not as a physical trait.
That's a good point.
So it's like, well, what are we talking about then? And what does that mean if the signs have that? You know, because I typically think of the signs as being more concrete, you know, and being more physically indicative. So,
well, some interesting things that I've seen with signs is like, so what the signs do have in this description of Brihat Parashara Horashastra is like medium-bodied, large bodied.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's
Exactly.
listed for every single sign, has a connotation to that. And he doesn't, it's not missed.
Right.
Or it's not missed in translation either.
Right, exactly. Whereas, when it starts getting into technical Ayurvedic terminology, the way that those terms are used in astrological texts and the way those terms are used in Ayurvedic texts is a little bit different. There's overlap. And in some cases, one word is being used to encompass various things that in our Ayurvedic text, we would be using 3 or 4 different words, So it really takes a lot of knowledge, I think, to discern like what's being meant. And we have the same problem with Brihad Parashara that we do with the Charaka Samhita, which is that it's a reconstructed text.
Well, actually, what's interesting, have you ever read the last chapter of Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra in the second volume?
I'm sure I have, but I wouldn't be able to tell you right now off the top of my head.
It freaking opened my mind not too recently when I just flipped to that chapter just out of just decided to look at that and look at the book from that perspective, because so much of the second volume is just like all the stuff about special rules about dashas, and it's just kind of like a really boring read. Not boring read, but it's like super technical, like, oh my god, how many things am I supposed to remember out of this? This is insane. And then at the very end, the last chapter, what it says is it's like, these are the things according to the sages. And he gives a list of sages. And so what that leads me to believe that what Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra is a compilation. And it makes sense. I mean, like Ernst and other people have talked about corruptions to Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra, where I don't really think it's corruptions. I think that's the way that it was meant. And so I don't know when it was written, because I don't know if it's, because what's interesting, so if it's all these other sages, there's no, okay, so this part is from Vyasa, this part is from so-and-so and so-and-so. There's no mention of that in here. All we know is that there's just like these chapters in the middle of other chapters, which feels strange. And then there's different techniques, Vimshopaka, Lajasthadiyavash, Shadbala, and all these things are like really in and of themselves, like whole techniques that you can't just apply from one freely to the other.
Right. And I think it's because ancient knowledge, originates in an oral tradition.
Right.
And the transmission of an oral tradition to a scriptural tradition is inevitably going to have what we call, quote, corruption, Right. It's just the nature of switching mediums, and then you have the problems of, history, culture, and time, and some unfortunate events that happen in the midst of that, and then the repiecings together by other people, and all those things happen too. And it's like, so that's just the nature of it, Right. I mean, if you look at the Ashtanga Hridayam by Bhagavata, I mean, it's just a recompilation of Charaka's thoughts.
Yeah.
But more or less.
I think that's very important, though. And I think that has to happen in every single era.
That's why people do it, right? Why does that happen? Why would you publish a scripture that's just a recapitulation of an existing one? Well, for that very reason. It's like, I think it was maybe woven into their fabric. It's like you recapitulate everything that came before you, so that it's preserved again.
What was interesting to me is that's kind of why I frown on a lot of these astrological conferences, because they're not that. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It's almost like they're there to, because I don't see it's not about like, let's meet of the minds and let's talk about these books and let's see what we all think and what we can all agree upon. It's just more like, it's not a conference in that matter, which I think would be so much more like positive. It's just more of a, it's kind of like an ego presenting, like, let me be the presenter and teach you some facet. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think astrology can, just like any field similar to it, can grow more from discussion and consideration and mutual conversation, right, than through presentation, of set fixed ideas to a group of people who are interested in them, because in a way we don't really have fixed ideas. I mean, of course we do, you know what I mean to say, but astrology beckons a level of free thinking, and real consideration and thought and philosophy. And
because there's a lot of the way we teach and learn in this modern time, whether you want to call that Kali Yuga or whatever you want to call it, is that it's a very standardized way of one person, and capitalism kind of gets in the way of this too, is one person trying to teach many at the same time. Where back in the days, it was Gurukula, all of this.
Right.
You know, whether you're talking Ayurveda, astrology, you're talking yoga, it was all like the guru might have had multiple students or multiple disciples, but it was like a lifelong process. So
yeah, you know, it's to learn astrology, to learn Ayurveda, to learn any of these things, you know, it requires a significant practice that's not just the mere absorption of knowledge, but a transformation of the being. You know, it's a real yoga to learn these things, and it's a lifelong process, and requires a lot of a person, you know, because these aren't light sciences, you know. Right. Ayurveda is not just about khichdi, you know. This is about an understanding of life, you know, and what it means to exist, and how existence is happening, you know, and in a very sophisticated, detailed understanding of that, you know. It's not just that there's unity. It's like, what about that unity, you know? How is that happening? What does it mean? You know, what about us? We have like complex physiologies, you know. So these are profound subjects, and they were rightly taught in a very profound setting, which today we don't have, you know. But I think it just is going to set, you know, astrologers apart from each other, because the people who really approach it with that kind of seriousness are going to come out with a totally different result in their practice than other people will. And that's just going to speak for itself, you know. Right.
So now kind of getting back into so we briefly started talking about like so we kind of talked about the signs, and I agree with you about the signs kind of being like the concrete reality. Yeah. Now let me ask you this: how do you tell how a sign is doing? I mean, what is your aspect to that? Do you just use like how the Lord is doing, cruel planet kind of idea, Rashi aspects?
Well, it's complex. I would say the first thing I'm going to do is see how the Lord is doing. Okay, how is the Rashi Lord? You know, is the Rashi Lord afflicted? You know, what are the Rashi Lord's avashtas? You know, what is that Rashi Lord's dignity? You know, are there you know, bad avashtas happening inside of this Rashi that's spoiling the Rashi? You know, those kind of things I'm going to look at. Inevitably, the Rashi is going to take us into a whole consideration of its Lord. You know.
Right.
I really feel that. But then I'm also interested to see, you know, what Rashis are being aspected by Rahu and Ketu. Okay? Because those are going to be the poisoned Rashis, you know, no matter what.
And I feel like it's kind of it's hard, or not hard. I think it's necessary to talk about Vargas when talking about Rashis too. And do you pull into the Vargas?
I will pull in the Vargas at a certain point, you know. To me, and maybe other people have different approaches to a Vargas, but I like to kind of get a sense of the Rashi chart just as it is, you know. Yeah. And once I've identified some things in there, you know, then I'm going to follow their trail, okay? And that's when I'm going to go into Vargas at that point, you know. But well, I don't usually pull them in until then, because then it gets to be, it's too much.
Lately, what I've been doing is I've been using the Vargas for dignity.
Right.
Like, for example, I'm like, okay, Jupiter is debilitated in the Rashi, but what does it look like in the 16 Vargas mentioned by Parashara? And I look deep into it, as it's like, well, because, you know, very easily that Jupiter can then be exalted in the second, or the Hora, the Drekana, and the Chaturtamsha.
I agree. I do the same thing. You know, if I identified an afflicted planet, I'm going to say, well, how is he doing overall? You know, that means all Vargas. You know, what's the dignity in all Vargas? Because maybe inevitably there's somewhere where he's doing great.
Right. And what I also use it for is, I think this kind of is a little bit when I start getting into someone's dashas, I'm definitely doing this where I'm looking at, so like, let's say someone's going into Saturn moon dasha. I look at in the Rashi chart, first and foremost, what is the relationship, especially the affectation between one and the other, right? Like Rashi placement away. And then I look, are they conjunct? Are they opposing, right? Are they giving full aspect, partial aspect? And then what I like to do is from that point, I look in, so if I'm looking at Saturn moon, I'm like, how many times is Saturn in Cancer? Or how many times are Saturn and moon in the same one? I try and get an idea of where and what that aspect of that Varga, which part of life that is focusing on, of where that's going to be like more strongly felt.
Yeah, exactly. I think, the Varga consideration is really it's just about tracing, how
Right.
deep does this go? And if it's going deeper, in what ways and where?
Because where I tread really lightly with Vargas is reading them as a chart. I'm not saying I don't do it, but that's less of a consideration for me than just seeing the path that the planet is in by being in that degree that it is in the Rashi chart.
Yeah, rather than focusing on charts, I just try to get the planets, and see like, well, how are they doing? And the chart is sort of the context, and so
Right.
I'm just see, how well is he doing across the board? How well is he doing here, where it really matters for the time being, and things like that,
Yeah.
Now, some people have, very sophisticated ways of using Vargas and so forth, and I have more to learn in that regard, and I commend those people. I am not somebody who has used goes crazy into Vargas. I'll say that, but I do use them, especially in medical readings. I'm definitely going to be looking at least 4 or 5 charts.
Yeah. So which Vargas do you look at when it comes to health, and what houses? We should get into that discussion as well.
Well, I'm definitely, just the basic, of course, is going to be, you're always going to want to see the 6th house, the 6th lord, because that is the house of enemies and disease. And so I'm always going to check that out. I'm always going to see how Virgo is doing for the same reason. And I'm always going to see how Saturn is doing, Saturn being the imposer of limitations. So, and by the time I keep going on this, I'm going to see how every planet's doing. Because it's just a rabbit hole.
But there is some truth to that, though, too.
Yeah. I mean, because by the time after I look at Sun, I'm going to say, well, how's the Sun doing for, the vitality of the person? And how's their Mars, And then, well, what about their Moon? And then what about Rahu Ketu, and how's their Mercury? And it's like, inevitably, I'm looking at the whole thing all at once,
Right.
But definitely the 6th house is important. But, even beyond houses, it's like wherever you've got those difficult avashtas, in terms of lajitati avashtas, we have that is, it really boils down to that for me. It's like, I look at those every time, always use those. Always going to check the Shambala. Are these planets even strong? If I see a weak planet right up the bat, it's like, okay, I know he's weak. So it's like, at least I have that information. Now let's see how he's doing, how he's performing and all that. But I'm going to take Avashta as kind of a say beyond dignity, I don't care if the planet's exalted, or I don't care,
I actually laugh at people that talk about exalted planets or whatever, because it's like there's so much more to it.
Yeah. And for the same thing with debilitated planets. I don't take a debilitated planet at face value either. I see a lot of debilitated planets that actually feel pretty good, Avashta wise,
Right.
You got to work a little harder to use them. They're fine, But the thing is, it's in a good state,
Right.
So I take Avashtas as kind of a senior consideration,
Mm-hmm.
Shadbala also filling the gaps there,
I'm big into Shadbala, and I look at all the individual. I look at why a planet is strong. I look at all the individual
And they're going to be strong in different ways. You know, the Shambala and all those things are going to give a different kind of a strength and indication, you know. I'm also going to look at D30, D27, you know, D10.
And what is your thoughts real quick? So like D30, we know to be the house of Arishtas or the house of fatality. So it's like the house of disease. It's like kind of like diving.
That's where it hits. That's where it goes wrong. You know, it's like, that's where you really see something. It's a deeper level, you know?
Yeah. So how do you look at then with the D27 and the D10 now?
D27, you know, I'm thinking as strengths and weaknesses, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just helping me fill in a picture of how's this person doing? What are they really strong? What are they weak in? But like I said, I'm not going to go to the Vargas until I've identified my planets, you know?
Right.
So I'm going to find my affliction, you know? And I might find my affliction through dashas, Rashi dashas, Vimshatari, or just through talking to them and seeing like, wow, they've really got Venus issues, you know? What's going on with Venus? You know, oh, well, he's starved and he's debilitated and, you know, in D27 or whatever. You know, I'm going to trace him at that point.
Have you found for different ascendants a difference in, say, a debilitated Venus? For example, a debilitated Venus for a Leo ascendant versus a debilitated ascendant for a Libra ascendant.
Well, if he's a Lagna Lord, obviously it's going to be a much bigger deal, you know.
Right.
And of course, that's true if we start looking into the nature of the house lords, you know, for each of the ascendants. You know, every planet has a kind of inherent weight in that sense, or effect in that sense. You know, weight's not really the right word here, but you know what I mean.
Right.
You know, I'm always going to look at the Lagna Lord. One of the first things I do, you know, is like, okay, here's the Lagna Lord. You know, if the Lagna Lord is in trouble, that's a big problem because that's the body. You know, that is the physical being. Now,
let me ask you this too. Like, so we're talking about Lajatati Avashtas now for a Jupiterian ascendant, Sag Pisces.
Mm-hmm.
Jupiter's two enemies are typically two benefic planets, where you look at, say, Saturn, whose three enemies are Moon, who's, you know, Moon, and then two cruel planets. So like the starvation, if that's the Lagna Lord, do you see, like for a Jupiterian ascendant, strongly starved by Venus? Do you see that as just as much of a health affectation as a starved Saturn for like a Capricorn ascendant for like by Mars and Sun?
I take those Lajatati Avashtas as kind of the concluding point.
Okay.
You know, despite, you know, what you're saying, you know, if the planet is starved, he's in trouble. You know.
So you're just looking at the nature of the Avashta, regardless of the planet that is affecting it. But I'm sure that gives some kind of idea.
Of course it does. I mean, yeah, I don't mean to say that I'm disregarding which planet.
No, I'm not accusing that either. I'm just curious. I'm just curious.
Right. Yeah, no, of course. I mean, like a starvation by Venus to Jupiter is going to be different than like a starvation by Mercury or something. You know?
Right.
So obviously that's going to factor into it. But whether the nature of those planets is benefic or malefic is really not relevant to me, because the fact is that in their natural relationships, this is how it's happening, and inevitably that's being reflected in the consciousness of the native.
Right.
You know? It's happening. You know, benefic or not. You know, it's going on. A starved Jupiter, even though Jupiter is his great planet, is still going to be a starved Jupiter.
Right.
Even if he's being starved by a benefic.
Right. Right.
Because to him, it's not really benefic, right? It becomes a context-dependent truth.
Okay.
Avashta-wise, at least, you know. Of course, there's different forms of relationship. There's different types of avashtas, you know. Then there's dignities, which, you know, are using not just natural relationships, but temporary relationships. So, you know, this becomes kind of a vast thing.
Did you watch Ernst, or have you seen Ernst's latest course on the avashtas that came out about a year and a half ago?
The one he's on Lajatati Avashtas?
Yeah. where he talks about the whole idea of like he's looking at Saturn first, you know, and he's talking about the energetic, the three different levels. Do you incorporate that when you look at Avashtas too? Do you see like, okay, Lagna Lord starved, and then also pairing that with, oh shoot, it looks like Saturn is starved. Maybe Saturn and Sun are mutually starving each other. Maybe they're conjunct to the exact degree and Saturn's combust or whatever.
Yeah.
Is that kind of like you start putting that?
Yes, I do. You know, the levels of health that Ernst is describing through the Avashtas is, I think, super important. And that's kind of what I was talking about earlier when I'm talking about the 5 koshas, the 5 sheaths, you know. Those are the 5 levels of health, you know. And the Avashtas indicate that as well, you know. So that's what I'm thinking about. You know, when I'm looking at Avashtas, I'm not just identifying an afflicted planet, I'm also identifying an affliction and the level at which that affliction is happening, you know, which is the most important piece of information.
Do you know what is my favorite Avashta? And I see why it is the name of the Lachastati Avashtas, is the Lajita.
Mm-hmm.
It is absolutely fascinating when you come across the people with the Lajita Avashta.
Mm-hmm.
How that can be something that's like the formation that it's like their consciousness is built upon that. And what I've seen with it, in one case I'm particularly thinking of, is it's like there's a point in life where they're crushed by that Avashta, and there's a point in life where they're propping themselves up with it, not necessarily in a like healthily constructed way.
Compensation.
Right. Yeah, I found it to be very, very, very fascinating.
Exactly. See, the Avashtas are like this great rabbit hole because you start to see not only the afflictions and where and what, but you also see that people are going to adopt a compensation strategy, you know, in the midst of it. A lot of people put on the exact opposite of all the limitations that exist in their chart.
Right.
There's highly compensated people, and those people, it's not that they don't have pathology, it's that their pathology is actually quite deep.
Right.
But it's not evident at a surface view.
So with that being said, then, this ties back into the question of health that I had for you is, so what is health in an astrological perspective to be healthy, deal with the constraints, confines, and promise of the natal chart?
Okay. So what is health astrologically? I mean, we can give one simple definition, which is health is the ability to, this is an unconventional definition. I'm going to give it anyways.
Right. And I think it's an unconventional idea of health in the first place.
It is. Astrological health, which really is kind of not actually a particular level of health, but a view of the totality of the levels of health, has everything to do with the ability of the native to deal with Rahu. Astrological health is basically about Rahu and the reason is because life is about growth and transcendence, or development and transcendence, or evolution, you know? The chart, the purpose of all the patterns in the chart are pointing to a picture of a transformative process that the native can potentially be engaged in. And the degree to which they are engaged in that, they're burning pathologies, you know? It's like there's just going to be a struggle, there's going to be afflictions, they're going to fall flat on their face, there's going to be difficulties. But those are difficulties that have to do with a death and a birth of something greater and newer, you know? So those are acceptable pathology. It's not really pathology, it's a purification. You know, it's like when you get a rash because you do a fast, you know, it's like, well, of course, you know, there's nothing wrong with it. That stuff's just coming out, you know? So to me, the health of a person in life altogether and through the chart, through astrology, is the ability of the person to engage a transformative process in which they're releasing Ketu, letting go of all past levels, letting go of all that they've been and achieved, so that they can disidentify with that present level and begin to integrate with an emerging level of consciousness, you know?
And
that's when we
failure
start to be healthy.
territory.
Yeah.
You know what I love are the charts where the lords of Ketu or Rahu are with the opposite node.
Mm,
It's always so fascinating how that
yeah.
works. And do
Yeah.
you
Rahu Ketu, the whole world.
read the nodes through the other charts? The node position, like do you take Rahu then and look how Rahu's doing in, I don't know, the Navamsha chart or something?
I could look at Navamsha. I don't typically, for whatever reason. I don't know if I can even explain it. But I do look at Rahu in the Vargas because Rahu is the great afflictor. Rahu and Ketu both. But, we see more disease coming from Rahu than anything else. It probably has to do with Rahu's kind of magnifying, aggravating, stirring energy,
Right.
And I don't know if he's actually causing disease or if he's bringing existing diseases to the surface,
Well, I also think I think a lot about with Rahu and Ketu when it comes to the idea of virus and bacteria. With Rahu being related to virus, Ketu being related to bacteria. Because what's interesting is so there are certain bacteria that we can become exposed to, but for the most part, the bacteria that we suffer from are the bacteria that's in our own gut, the bacteria that's in our own body, that happens because of that. Whereas virus itself is something that is foreign to the body.
Right. Comes upon you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You have to contract it.
Right. Where it's like Ketu is, it's like we've got to learn to deal with what is inherently in us and who we are, what constitutes us and what keeps us going. Whereas
that's an excellent way of looking at Rahu and Ketu in terms of virus and bacteria, the way that that's described. Yeah.
And then the other thing I think about when it comes to health, I think about, I always think of the 6th house in Virgo. And the reason why I think of those two houses is I basically equate them to the gut.
Exactly.
Because that's really all, those are the two of the big touching points on Ayurveda, right? Are digestion, elimination on all levels, but on the physical level where it happens is that area of the body, the intestine.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons Virgo and 6th house is important, and Mercury, the state of Mercury altogether. Okay, so important because when Ayurveda is talking about digestion, we typically think about it as physical digestion and Agni and digestive fire, but really digestion is just the articulation of a universal process that's happening at all levels.
Right.
In other words, even the breath, is about reception and release. So our life altogether, our health altogether, this is a more essential definition of health. It's really our ability to receive and release, which is what I was talking about with Rahu and Ketu also, So we have to be able to receive, but in order to receive, we need to also release. So there needs to be a balance in that cycle.
Right, just like Pachaka Pitta, right? Which is supposed to be the body's or Pitta ability, whatever, in the gut to be able to separate that which is going to be for nourishment, that which is going to be separated for waste, and I think
which is also Samanavayu, which is also what's happening in the small intestine. It's that's why Virgo rules the intestines, because that's where the body assimilates or receives what's good and releases what it doesn't need. And you'll see that everybody who's afflicted in any way whatsoever at any level is basically suffering at that very process, They're holding on to something they don't need, that's backed up in them, and they haven't been able to receive the nourishment that they need to survive. Both of those poles.
And what's so interesting, I see a lot of Virgo people have a similar nature about them, or people with prominent Virgo or 6th house have that very, very similar kind of that's kind of the paradigm they're placed upon. Where it's about separating this. And what I also see with them is that whole they create such structures.
Yeah. Mercury's the great discriminator,
Right.
Not in a bad way, in the sense of delineating.
Right.
Mercury's the exercise of discriminative intelligence, so Mercury sees what's good, what's useful, and exactly what's not. He's not going to absorb what's not. He's going to let that go. That's why mercurial people are such, friendly and good, you know, good friends to people. It's like they see like the good, you know, in people, and they're like, that's great, you know, these good qualities, I'm gonna, you know, participate in that. And you got some dark stuff too, but like just forget about that, you know.
That's yours to deal with, not
exactly.
deal with a friendship. Right.
Exactly. I'm not going to discount you because of that. I'm just going to learn how to take the good from you, you know? So that's why Mercury is important in making a life, you know, a life that works, making life work, you know? That's why health, you know, really has to do with conductivity, reception, release, you know, receiving energy and releasing energy, inhalation, exhalation, you know, integrating with Rahu and letting go of Ketu, you know, which we don't need, you know, we don't need Ketu, you know? So that's, I guess that I've come to my a better definition there from how I started. That's really what I meant to say, talking about Rahu and Ketu.
Well, it just took us an hour and 15 to get there. Yeah.
Well, and to make one more connection, you know, it's like we talked about, you know, digestion, and I'm talking about the transformative process, and that's really what Agni is. You know, Agni is the transformative process. So Ayurveda tells us that when Agni is balanced, you know, this very process, the reception and release, occurs as it should. Agni fully digests the food it should, and as a result of that, there's nothing left over. Waste products are released, you know. So it's like Agni, the transformative process here, is the key to maintaining that balance. That's why I'm saying that, to me, the health of a person astrologically and altogether is their ability to participate in a transformative process, which is the Rahu Ketu process, you know?
Right. So now one thing I wanted to talk to you, when you're looking at a chart, like, do you ever look at the dhatus? Do you ever make any kind of like assessment of the dhatus based upon what you see in the chart?
I do. I don't do it every time. I don't do it in any systematic way. Often if a person comes to me with a health issue that I know is in a specific dhatu, I'll check it out, you know, the corresponding planet and their other dhatus. Sometimes I will, you know, if I see an afflicted planet, you know, really bad, I'll think, oh, wow, you know, they probably have issues in that dhatu, you know?
And what I think is really interesting is that the first dhatu, rasa, is ruled by Mercury. And much of what we were just talking about, like that's like the first tissue, the first layer. Yeah, I just found that fascinating because I've listed them out recently in their order, not in the planetary order that we all know, Sun's, Moon, Mars, etc. But of looking at it as Mercury, Moon, Saturn, Jupiter, Sun, Mars, Venus. So I don't know. I'm just curious if you've ever worked with that order of the planets or looked at it in any light.
You know, I'm going to open up my document here because I did make it. I did write out the 7 dhatus. And the thing about the dhatus is that it doesn't agree. The astrological breakdown of planets and dhatus does not agree with the Ayurvedic sense of it. Not completely. Let me just pull this up if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. Okay. So, you know, here we have discrepancies because we also said Priyat Parashar tells us that Mercury rules the skin, you know, and they call that a dhatu, you know, and it's like.
Well, I've actually seen a, where that opened it up for me. At first when I saw that, I was like, that doesn't make any sense. But I've actually seen somewhere, I came across something, I don't know if it was online or in a book or something like that, where I actually saw somewhere it was something about Ayurveda where it was like, where it described the skin as the first layer. Yeah.
Well, there's a strong relationship between rasa dhatu and the skin.
Right.
You know? If you see dry skin, your first thought is going to be, oh, there's a problem with the rasa dhatu, you know? Because rasa dhatu is hydrating the skin. It has a lot to do with maintaining the skin. So, yeah, That's why, you know, next to Rasa Dhatu, I have written Mercury. I also have the moon, though.
Why so?
That's because the moon, because the moon governs all fluids.
Right.
You know, so the moon has its relationship to fluid as well. So I think moon needs to be part of Rasa Dhatu in terms of its rulership. Both those planets have to be looked at.
Okay. So you're saying it's not as simple as just taking 7 planets, corresponding them to the Sapta Dhatus and calling it good. And having that be, of course, here's the thing, reliable.
Yeah, exactly. You can make that. If you want to have a 7-to-7 correlation, it can be done. But I don't think it's the most accurate. You know, I think there's, in many dhatus, there's multiple planets. Well, by multiple, I mean maybe up to 2 or 3, you know, 2 at the most usually, that are in play.
Like the same thing with Prakriti. I have yet to find a technique to define Prakriti that is reliable without having to go, I can see it because of this. And then you're discounting the huge, you know, you're looking at somebody maybe that's, you know, strongly Pitta or strongly Kapha. You're knowing that by direct observation and through their personality and your interaction with them. And then you're looking at their chart and you're like, well, it's an air sign and strongest influence is Saturn, or maybe it is Aquarius, you know. And
yeah, see, you know, I'm gonna say something heretical, you know, for an Ayurvedic practitioner, which is that I don't give any consideration to Prakriti.
You don't give any consideration.
None. I'm only interested in Vikriti.
Well, of course. I mean, whatever you're treating is Vikriti.
Exactly. But people are a conglomeration, you know, of their Prakriti and Vikriti. And so, you know, the ideal of like identifying, you know, what their Prakriti really is basically an impossible task by any means,
right.
As far as I can see. Not that I'm not going to take into account their physiological tendencies and their constitutional tendencies when prescribing remedies and herbs. Of course I am. I can see a Pitta person, a Vata person, a Kapha person, you know, I see that. But to really identify their original nature, I mean, it's like, it's one of the more elusive tasks, and the relevance of it is questionable to me. I see enough of what their tendencies are to know where I need to go, basically. Whether that's actually their Prakriti, I don't know. But it's good enough for me. You know, Vaidya Mishra was like that. He said, you know, he didn't really give any concern to Prakriti. You know, he just said, what's clinically relevant is Vikriti. You know, that says everything. And
right.
His formulations, I think, his approach was more or less a tridoshic approach, you know. So if you give a treatment, an herb, you know, it's pretty much something that's not going to aggravate Vata, it's not going to aggravate Pitta, it's not going to aggravate Kapha. I think that's a wise approach.
Right. Right. Yeah, because I've seen stuff from like, I don't care, David Frawley. I was going to say I don't want to name names, but I'm like, whatever. Like, where like I have his book, I don't know if it was the Ayurveda and Astrology or if it's Astrology of the Seers or what book that he has that I was reading it in, where he was talking about Prakriti and I couldn't make it work on my chart. I'm like, that doesn't describe any of these charts that I'm looking at of these people using his method. And then what's interesting is uses the word prominent a lot. Like you have to see the planet in the chart. And I was like, yeah, you don't even define what that. And then what I thought was interesting is it's like now you're turning it into disproving efficacy of astrology.
Yeah, I mean, Prakriti is so complex, and so in the chart it's really complex too. It's not just the Lagna; it's also, you know, the Lagna and the Navamsha. It's also the Lagna Lord. It's also, you know, the state of the Lagna Lord. It's also the predominance of the elements in all the Rashis. You know, it's like it's so many things.
I've actually tried to do it. I've tried mathematical processes by giving a certain weight to a conjunction, a certain, you know, of like the Lagna Lord or the Lagna in the 6th house and yada, 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 yada. And I thought it was really interesting because I tried everything that was used, which is really just kind of a thumb rule stuff. And then I tried to get more specific with it, kind of with what I know. And I'm like, it's interesting. I've never really figured that out. And so that's Prakriti. Now, with Vikriti, do you have any, have you seen the Vikriti line up with the charts at all?
Well, to me, Vikriti is any affliction I see.
Okay.
And yeah, every time, I mean, somebody presents to me with their symptoms, it's there in the chart every time. I mean, it's always in the chart. That's what's so cool.
Right. Like, for example, I have, so Pisces ascendant, Saturn and Mars and Leo in the 6th house. So like, I have a lot of problems with digestion in my time, of it moving too fast, of it
moving in the wrong ways or not moving in the way it should. And
right. So I have seen that happen. What I haven't taken the time to, because I've really started thinking, I'm like, well, maybe the property is determined by also when you start seeing through the transits. Maybe if you have like I do, the conjunction of Saturn and Mars, maybe when they're strongly squaring or whatever, aspecting, conjunct in the sky, perhaps that brings about certain, those times too. I don't know if you've seen that during Bhuktis also.
I haven't thought of examining the natal transits and things like that. I find more or less there's enough indications of the person's constitution, property-wise, through the lagna, through their dominant planets and the elemental play of the chart, more or less, but even philosophically, I think it's questionable whether that is a search that's worth going into, because this whole idea that we're just supposed to live according to our original nature, it's like we should just live in accordance with our birth chart then, but I don't really see it that way. I don't think people really need to live in accordance with their birth chart. I think their birth chart is like the launching pad, for where they need to go. So this whole idea of returning to some kind of ideal natal state, I don't know. I don't really agree with that. And its applicability for healing and therapy is too elusive to be worthwhile, in my opinion. So find the Vikriti, get a good read on the person, you're going to be totally fine.
Right. And
you want to run through the dhatus or?
No, that's kind of because I'm assuming that if you're watching this, you have an idea of
dhatus and planets.
Yeah, it's not that hard to find this information. And I don't really want to take time. I'm not here to explain what Vata is, Kapha, Pitta. I assume there's a million things to read on that. So I'm trying to stay away from that whole thing. More into like the philosophical and more into like what we're actually seeing with charts in relation to health.
Sure.
Yeah. So so do you now using timing methods? Like if you see someone's in a particular bhukti, does that mean you experience to see, or you expect to see a certain condition within the person? Like if you see somebody in a Mars dasha or Mars bhukti, do you think, okay, this person might be coming in with energetic issues or martial problems?
The way I see it is this. I don't see that there's a direct. Okay, let me rewind. Let me put it this way.
Okay.
I see dashas and transits as triggers. Okay. What they trigger though could be something else. So because the state of a planet, of course we're going to trace the planet that we're seeing as the transit or the dasha or the bhukti or whatever. We have a launching pad now. So we're going to look at that planet and we're going to see what's happening, what got triggered, Well, that planet might, be afflicting another planet. So the affliction really is not about that planet, but about the one it's afflicting, or it could be, you don't know where the rabbit hole is going to go, basically. So I don't see like a totally direct correlation between transits and dashas and the affliction itself. But I do see always a trigger, and I do find the affliction from it. Yeah.
Interesting.
And I think it's good because it reveals the present time. But what's being revealed in the present is not often originating in the present, or it's from a different time, it's a past pathology that's being brought out now, or it's,
Yeah. I mean, how little of our lives actually deals with something new coming into our life.
Right.
And how
very
much
little
of our lives is about what we're all, because everything in life is so like in giant cycles, right? between where you
Exactly.
live, your career, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and if we're really good, if we're really astute, we'll find the triggered affliction that's bringing out something buried, but we'll also see the affliction that they're creating right now, you know?
Right.
Because they're also in that book, there's something going on that's going to become a future affliction that, you know, in another chart, somebody's going to say, oh, this deeper pathology is coming out. Well, they're creating it in that moment, you know? So it's important to zone in on the psychology of the dashas for people, I think.
So I have a question for you about, have you studied Jaimini at all?
A little bit. I haven't gone into Jaimini nearly as deeply as I need to.
Yeah,
But I do
I
like
was
those
just
Rashi
wondering.
dashas. I use the Rashi dashas. I do look at, you know, I do look at the Jaimini Screaming Kala for the Atma Karaka, the Dara Karaka. I look at all those, you know, I consider those. But I'm not an expert on Jaimini by any means.
Well, Jaimini is a very, very, very interesting, I'll put it, system. But they has like these interesting health thing that it says. It says something about the influence of the fourth from the Swamsha, which the Swamsha being the where the Amakara is
Right.
the Vamsha,
Right.
being like influenced by Moon, Mars, and Rahu means something for health. I haven't ever actually like traced it because like Jaimini, what I kind of like shun away from Jaimini is like just a bunch of rules. Like if there's
Yeah.
this affecting the fourth, this affecting the ninth, it's not really like an open system like, for example, Avashtas.
Yeah. You know, I think that there's a lot in the Jaimini system that is applicable for medical purposes. But there's only one person I trust to tell me anything about it, and that's Ernst Wilhelm. Because, man, that stuff is cryptic, you know?
Yeah.
And he seems to have a unique city for understanding those things and finding the connections and testing them and seeing that finding out what it really means, you know? And so I know there's definitely things we're doing with homeopathy along those lines that I can't actually talk about in any detail because it's still being tested. But I've just seen how he brings out these things and how it makes sense. And, you know, you can test it and see that it works. But if I were to look at it raw, I mean, boy, I would never have figured it out, you know, or come to that point.
Right.
Maybe, you know, if I'd really meditated on it, but he's right in there with it. And so I think there is a lot in Jaimini that is super, super awesome and important and relevant that actually we haven't discovered or applied yet medically.
Well, and it's just so funny, even working with, I just really like, it's taking a long time for me to be able to use Jaimini just for career.
There's some complex techniques in there for sure.
Because it gets to the point of like, you're looking at it and you're like, because there's a way of determining career planets. And sometimes you're looking at a chart and you're like, every single one of these planets is connected together. All the houses share a connection by rulership or by being ruled by.
Yeah, right.
It's like, damn.
You know, it's interesting because Jaimini obviously represents the concrete, you know, the what, you know, and Parashara is definitely a lot more of the internal and then the why and the hows of a person, you know,
but Jaimini is contained within the pages of Parashara, but not necessarily in a
right
translation as what Ernst has.
Exactly. And you know, I tend to be leaning more towards Parashara astrology for the obvious reasons, but that's because I think that it doesn't really, you know, we can see all of the what of a person, but what's more important is what they're going to do with that and how they're going to deal with that, and their ability to understand the why of that, you know. So that's what I think. You know, health is a transformation in consciousness. You know, I don't just want to rattle off to people, you know, what they've got and what they're going to have, and you know, all that concreteness, you know, which is really what a lot of people are looking for, in fact, but. You know, the internal stuff is really where it's at.
Yeah.
Not to discount Jaimini at all, though. I think, you know, I certainly use Jaimini techniques and rely on aspects of Jaimini astrology.
what's interesting to me about Gemini is like there's that whole game of cryptology of like how or the cryptic nature of the way that those verses are made. But in Gemini, there is a clear like focus, right, on the planet that's in the highest degree in the sign. And what I think is interesting about that is like when I think about that, I'm like, why would that be the case? What does that tell us? And to me, what that tells us is that this was Gemini might have, this is possibly the case, I don't know if it's true, might have been developed at a time where what they didn't really have is an exactitude possibly of where to place the ascendant, and they knew that that could be, you know, like trying to find the exact time might have been more difficult back then, because nowadays we just go, you know, boom, first breath, 12:35 and 42 seconds or whatever, and that's a time that nowadays is the same. It's not just like one clock is different. But so well, my point is back then, maybe Gemini was created because what they were focusing on was, well, let's just look at which planets are the furthest along based on this general ascendant being within this time period.
Yeah, I have no idea. You know, I tend to think of that, the Atmakaraka, as a, you know, a different level of self factor, you know, than the other self factors in the chart. So I always like to know the Atmakaraka and see how the Atmakaraka is doing. I like to see the Swamsha. You know, I don't know exactly, you know, what the meaning is of that high degree thing. Maybe, you know, I tend to think of it as like maybe that's the planet that has like the strongest energy, you know, in the sign. It's like,
but it's an interesting idea that the flow through the sign, because the signs aren't a like they're not physical objects. Signs are representation of time.
right.
You know, the signs don't. But what's interesting though is the signs are representation of time, but they are very well indicative of place.
Exactly. And I think this is where, you know, Ernst is really clear, and I appreciate that delineation of his, which is that the Rashis are the containers of consciousness, you know, like the planets are the energy or the consciousness, but the Rashis are like the vessels, the body of that, you know, which we even know because when we look at the charts, we know that the Rashis represent, you know, parts of the body from Aries to Pisces, from the head to the feet, you know.
Well, and even in that, that's the first paragraph in Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. I think it's chapter 4, or the first verse, excuse me. What Parashara says in that is that the Rashis are like the manifestation, or whatever the word that he used, of Kala Purusha.
Right, exactly.
And then he even says right there with head, face, neck, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. And that's important for medical astrology.
Mm-hmm.
The Rashis and the body parts, definitely.
So real quick, so with the Rashis and the body parts, I've heard it talked about as Aries represents the head, and then I've heard people say that you rotate it with whatever the ascendant is, with the ascendant representing the head. Have you, or do you just take it as
I haven't done that.
Okay.
I haven't done that. I just look at it as it is in the chart, you know, Aries to Pisces and wherever the planets are in there, you know?
Yeah. So, any case, we're about an hour 40 into this.
Okay.
So, in wrapping up, I don't really think there's any specific questions or anything that we didn't touch on to some degree. Is there anything that you want to add to this discussion?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
I think you know, maybe if people have questions or something, you know, after seeing the video, we can get into that.
Right. All right. So with that being said, thank you for your time. Namaste.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right. So